There is a photograph taken shortly before the disaster. It shows a steamboat on the Mississippi River, stopped at Helena, Arkansas. The date is late April 1865. The war is ending. Look at the decks. The boat is barely visible. Every surface is covered with men. Along the railings, across the upper levels, packed into every available space. The vessel does not look like a riverboat carrying passengers. It looks like something already beyond its limit. That photograph was taken before any explosion, before any inquiry, before any newspaper headline that did not get written. The boat in that photograph is Sultana, and if you know where to look, the disaster's already there. About 1,700 people died when Sultana's boilers exploded in the early morning of April 27, 1865, north of Memphis. Most modern accounts place the number somewhere in that range, though estimates across different sources reach higher. Whatever the exact count, it is larger than Titanic's. It makes Sultana the worst maritime disaster in American history. The country barely noticed. The week belonged to other things. Abraham Lincoln had been shot on April 14th. John Wilkes Booth was killed on April 26th, the day before Sultana's boilers exploded. The Civil War was reaching its last mechanical collapse, and the national machinery of mourning, victory, and exhaustion was already running at full capacity. The disaster was reported. It was not hidden, but it arrived inside a news cycle that had no room left, and it did not become the national story its dead were owed. That gap, in between scale and memory, is part of what makes Sultana worth examining. But it is not the main question. The main question is not why the disaster was forgotten. It is why the boat was allowed to leave. Memphis received the survivors the way cities near disasters always do, in fragments. Bodies pulled from the river. Men carried into overwhelmed hospitals. Names that arrived without a clean passenger list behind them. Survivors clung to wreckage, reached the shoreline, or were pulled from the water in the dark. Some of the men who made it to shore had survived Andersonville and Cahaba and months of captivity, only to spend the night clinging to debris in the Mississippi River. They were brought into a city that was still processing the news of Lincoln's assassination and Booth's death. The hospitals filled. The relief effort was improvised. One of the hardest problems facing Memphis in the days after was that no one knew exactly how many people had been on the boat. The hospitals could count the living. No one could say with certainty how many were still missing, because no one had ever produced a complete list of who had boarded. The press reported the disaster, but the Sultana story competed for column space with assassination aftermath. With the news of Booth's death printed that same morning, with surrender dispatches from the South, and with the accumulated weight of 4 years of war trying to find its ending. The popular explanation that the disaster vanished entirely because of Lincoln is partly right and too simple. Sultana arrived at the worst possible moment in the American calendar. It was not erased. It was crowded out, and then it stayed out. The inquiry that opened afterward did what such inquiries often do. It took a river full of wreckage and turned it into questions about orders, payments, repairs, and who had the authority to say no. That is the structure this account follows, not forward from the dock at Vicksburg, but backward from the questions the inquiry could not close. 3 lines of responsibility run through the record. The captain who wanted the load, the Army officers who controlled prisoner transport, and the government payment system that had turned each additional man into revenue. Captain J. Cass Mason commanded Sultana. Reuben Hatch was an Army quartermaster officer involved in arranging the prisoner transport contracts at Vicksburg, the man with authority over which boats received which loads. Frederick Speed was the officer responsible for managing the prisoner transfer process on the Army side. Later testimony and summaries placed both men at the center of the loading decisions. The United States government paid steamboat operators by headcount to transport paroled prisoners north. Each additional man aboard translated directly into contract value. The financial logic this created was not subtle. A larger load meant a larger payment. A delay to the schedule meant a smaller or later payment, or the risk of losing the contract to another operator. The payment system did not order anyone to overload a damaged boat. It simply made overloading the most profitable choice available. What survives from Vicksburg does not preserve every private arrangement made there. Testimony and later summaries connect the loading decisions to allegations of bribery or improper payments between transport officers and the boat's operators. The precise nature of those arrangements cannot be reconstructed from what has come down to us. What remains is allegations, named individuals, and a set of absences where a complete account would require private conversations that were either never written down or were never meant to survive. For the men waiting at Vicksburg, none of that accounting was visible. The war had become, for them, a logistics problem. It had become a riverboat berth, a government officer calling names from a list, and a question of how many days it would take to get home. Many were paroled prisoners recently released from Confederate camps. Some had survived Andersonville. Some had survived Cahaba. Later Sultana histories remember them not first as passengers, but as men who believed the worst part was finished. Those later accounts should be treated as reconstruction. Individual memories were set down long after 1865, and they carry the shape of what the survivors already knew had happened. What the confirmed facts give us is more spare and sufficient. They were paroled Union prisoners of war, weakened by captivity, being transported home by a government that was paying by headcount, crowded onto a vessel that was not built for them. Sultana was a working river machine, not a memorial. She was built for far fewer people than she carried that night. Institutional summaries describe her as loaded to several times her intended or legal capacity. Her boilers belonged to a technology that every river town in America already knew could fail. Boiler explosions on western rivers were not rare events. They were common enough to be regulated, insured, and studied, and still underestimated whenever schedule and money pushed against caution. At Vicksburg, before departure, Sultana had a damaged boiler. A boiler is the pressure vessel that converts heat and water into steam. The steam drives the engine. When the vessel holds, the system works. When it fails, the energy stored inside it does not release gradually or politely. It releases at once. Later boiler analysis and testimony confirmed that the damage was identified before departure and that a repair was made. The kind of repair chosen is where the story turns. Nathan Wintringer was Sultana's chief engineer. He is not a name that appears in most popular accounts of the disaster, but later Sultana histories and boiler analysis place him at the center of the most consequential decision in the chain. Wintringer looked at the damaged boiler and wanted more than a patch. He wanted a complete or substantially fuller repair. That kind of repair would take time. Time meant delay. Delay meant the schedule slipped, the contract was at risk, and the men waiting on the dock kept waiting. The boat got the patch. That is the warning this record identifies. Not a formal report filed with an authority that ignored it. Not a telegraph sent and never answered. The warning was an engineer looking at a damaged boiler, understanding what he was looking at, and asking for the repair the situation required. The answer was a faster, cheaper fix that kept the boat moving. A later Hartford steam boiler technical analysis treats the Sultana failure as a boiler engineering problem with multiple contributing factors. The condition of the boiler material, sediment accumulated from the Mississippi, operating pressure, and the physical listing of a dangerously overloaded vessel, which caused uneven water levels inside the boiler itself. Not one cause. A convergence of conditions that had been accumulating since before the boat left the dock. The fatal assumption running through all of it was that capacity was elastic. The river trip was short. The war was ending. The men needed to move. Each of those things was true. None of them changed the physics of what a damaged patch boiler does when it is running hot under an overloaded listing hull in the dark hours before dawn. The river north of Memphis in the early morning of April 27 was dark and cold. Most of the men aboard were asleep or trying to sleep. Some were below decks. Many were lying or sitting wherever they could find space on a boat, so crowded there was almost no unclaimed surface. The engines were running. The boilers were under pressure. One or more boilers exploded. The force of the blast tore through the decks. The superstructure of the boat broke apart. Fire caught immediately. The wood of a mid-19th century riverboat did not need long to burn. Men who had survived months in Confederate prison camps were thrown into the Mississippi River in darkness, many of them barely strong enough to swim, into water cold enough to kill. Those who were not thrown in faced a choice between fire and the river. Many chose the river. Some reached wreckage. Some reached the shoreline. Some were pulled out by people who heard the explosion from the banks and came to the water's edge, not knowing yet what they would find. Many did not survive. The final number is not clean. About 1,700 is the figure most often cited, and most modern accounts place the death toll in roughly that range, with some estimates reaching higher. The uncertainty is not a footnote, it is a consequence. The passenger lists were incomplete before departure. The men had been processed by a war that was already bad at counting its wounded and its newly released prisoners. When the boat broke apart in the dark, there was no clean record of who had been aboard and no orderly way to account for who survived. Those gaps in the count are themselves evidence of how the loading was managed. The point of no return was not the explosion. Working backward through what the inquiry assembled, the irreversible decision was made at the dock in Vicksburg. A patched boiler, a severely overcrowded boat, a financial structure that had already made delay the worst available option. The explosion was the completion of a sequence. It was not where the sequence began. A chain reaction does not mean no one is responsible. It means responsibility is distributed across decisions that each look smaller when isolated than they were in combination. The captain wanted the load. The payment structure rewarded the load. The repair was chosen to protect the schedule. The overcrowding was permitted because the trip was short and the men needed to move. Each decision was made by someone with authority and a reason. The chain connected them. The official aftermath produced proceedings, named individuals, and accusations. It did not produce accountability proportionate to the scale of the dead. Frederick Speed was court-martialed. The proceedings did not end in punishment that settled the public account. Reuben Hatch was investigated and avoided decisive accountability. The testimony points to an inquiry that identified the relevant actors, accumulated evidence, and then lost force before it reached a conclusion proportionate to what the river had taken. The accountability thinned out as it moved toward the men who had the most authority over the decisions that mattered. By 1865, America had already spent decades accumulating steamboat disaster data. Major federal inspection laws existed before Sultana exploded. The danger of river boilers was not a revelation. It was a known, regulated, insured, studied risk. In the Coast Guard's marine safety history, Sultana is placed within a longer sequence of maritime incidents that gradually pushed federal oversight towards something with actual teeth. But the lesson Sultana repeated was the same one the country had already been taught. Knowing a danger exists and building systems that actually prevent it are two entirely different things. Wintringer knew what an under-repaired boiler could do. The men who overruled him knew too. The knowledge did not change the decision. The easy versions of this story are cleaner than the evidence. One says the disaster vanished because Lincoln was assassinated. Another says it was caused by sabotage. A third says it was an unpredictable mechanical failure, a freak accident, no one's fault. Later theories have proposed sabotage. The technical and institutional sources do not require that explanation. The Hartford steam boiler analysis accounts for the failure through boiler condition, physical stress, sediment, water behavior, and operating pressure. No external actor needed. The Lincoln explanation is partly right, but incomplete. The disaster was reported. It was eclipsed not by one event, but by a news environment so saturated with the end of a 4-year war that even a catastrophe of this scale could not break through. What the evidence gives instead is less comfortable. A damaged boat, a crowded contract, a cheap repair chosen over a safe delay, an engineer whose objection was heard and set aside, accountability that thinned out when it reached the men with the most power. My read is that Sultana's most important evidence is not the number of dead. The number is the consequence. The most important evidence is the moment when a safer delay became the option the system was least prepared to choose. The payment structure made delay expensive. The loading pressure made it inconvenient. The repair decision made it impossible. When the explosion came, it came at the end of a sequence of choices that each made sense inside the logic that produced them. That is what makes this disaster something more than a tragedy. It is a record of how a system processes the cost of caution and prices it out. We do not have every passenger name. We do not have every private bargain struck at Vicksburg. We do not have the words spoken over the boiler before the patch went on. Not Wintringer's argument, not the reply that ended it, not the exact moment when the question of a proper repair stopped being a question. What survives is the shape of that moment. A man who understood the risk, a system that had already decided the risk was acceptable, and a boat that left the dock on schedule. Those absences are not incidental. They are structural. They mark the distance between what was preserved and what actually determined the outcome. The question Sultana leaves open is not whether the warning existed. It existed in the engineer's objection. It existed in the nature of the patch. It existed in the photograph at Helena, where the overloading was visible before any testimony described it. The question is whether a warning can matter inside a system that has already learned to price delay as loss.